So what are the politics of taking this fight any further? Let's bring in our front bench. Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's a senior advisor at North Star Public Affairs. Melanie Paradis is former communications director to Aaron O'Toole. She's now the president of Texture Communications. Former interim NDP national director Carl Belanger is here with us. He's now the president of Traction Strategies. And next to him is CTV national news correspondent Rachel Aiello. Welcome to Friday, everyone. Thanks for being here. So let's pick up on that question that I put to everyone at the beginning of this panel. Sabrina, what are the stakes for the federal government of trying to take this fight to the Supreme Court?
I am not sure that the Mark Carney government will take this fight to the Supreme Court because, I mean, again, I think one of the distinctions is that this happened under the Trudeau, obviously under Trudeau as Prime Minister, and I think Mark Carney's done a lot of things to be distinctly different from anything that Justin Trudeau did. I think there's two implications, though, for the government in general. So number one, I think from a political standpoint, there's not a lot of repercussions here. I think Canadians have largely forgotten about this, maybe not the downtown Ottawa precinct, but certainly across the country. I don't think this matters to the majority of Canadians. And I think that the second really important question is going to be, is what does define a national security threat? And in 2022, that maybe didn't matter as much because we had some good friends down south of the border. It matters a lot now. And so I think for Carney and for the public safety team to really go back and think about the implications of this and with respect to what a real public security threat looks like, especially when you think about, like, for example, the separatist movement in Alberta. I think that's going to be the biggest question that they're going to have to face, and maybe not publicly, but certainly internally.
And Melanie, I mean, add to that the separatist movement in Quebec as well. But do you think that this is really, as Sabrina said, something that is 100% on the Trudeau government, and that the Carney government really is not going to wear any of this?
So far, he hasn't worn much at all of the Trudeau government. I mean, look, the other ministers that were involved in this were Marco Mendicino and David Lametti, and they are also not in cabinet now, although we're both senior advisors to the Prime Minister, and so they do still kind of lurk around in the background, I guess. I really think that they will not appeal this to the Supreme Court. I think that it would be wise for them to determine what appropriate restitution would be for the victims of this government overreach. So there are individuals whose bank accounts were frozen. There are people who lost their jobs because they donated like $100 to a GoFundMe. There were some pretty crazy things that happened during that period of time. And I think that the government would be wise to look at ways to compensate people who were hurt by this government overreach, and then, like, move on. I think that they're going to try to do that as quickly as possible because, frankly, that's been the Mark Carney playbook all along.
Yeah, it's interesting, Carl, because, you know, maybe that is in the cards, but certainly you have to wonder what the government would be weighing if they went Mel's direction and basically looked at some sort of compensation and just tried to say, okay, let's put this in the past.
Well, they can try to compensate, but if they don't, there will be lawsuits for sure. Yeah. So one way or the other, if they don't appeal this, it's not over. There's going to be more court hearings, more testimony. And so the question is how does the Mark Carney government wants to defend that decision by the Trudeau government? Do they want to go and fight at the Supreme Court and have a chance to overthrow this, or do they want to face multiple challenges? Because how do you offer a compensation, and how is it sufficient for those victims? That's going to be the question, because, you know, if you feel that you've been wronged, and so far the court says that you've been wronged, then you are in your right to ask for compensation, and what the government is going to offer is likely going to be seen as too low. Yeah. So at the end of the day, the taxpayers will pay the price for that. Now, the question politically is, how do you defend that Trudeau government decision? And if you don't, you're still going to end up having to pay the price anyway.
Yeah, because, you know, this government, Rachel, goes to great pains to say we're not the other government. We have heard it a number of times. But at the same time, to Carl's point, it was a decision made at a moment in time that a commission looked at and had judged, you know, that was right at the time. But legally, it's not meeting the threshold. So it really is a position almost like where the Carney government has to make a decision, not only for today, but for tomorrow and years on.
Yeah, certainly. I think at this point with this story, it is more deciding how the history books are going to remember this, because Canadians, I think, have largely made up their mind on this story. So politically, I don't see there being much damage for the Carney government if they decide one way or the other here. Really, I think Canadians have close this chapter, with the exception of those, obviously, who are continuing this fight. I think largely it's going to be an issue that potentially could blow back on folks like David Lametti, who is now representing Canada at the UN, who will likely be talking a lot about upholding the rule of law, for example, in that position. But for Prime Minister Mark Carney, I think he can basically just said what he said in China this week. This is a new Prime Minister, this is a new government, we have a new approach, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think this could be something that if he doesn't want to drag this out in the courts and focus his attention to other places, could be rather quickly wrapped up. But the other part of this I'm watching for, Mike, is how Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre goes after this. Obviously, he's got his leadership review coming up quite closely. He mined this for some good support at the time. Does he try to revive this, or is he also understanding that most Canadians
he did get some good support at a time from a certain segment of the population, but it hurt him with another segment of the population because it painted him in a corner that and that stuck with him all the way through the election.
Yeah, well, I guess it'll depend on which segment of that is showing up in Calgary in a few weeks.
Yeah, Mel, how does he balance that? Because this is something that may, I mean, to Carl and Rachel's point, actually be a bigger problem for Poilievre.
I don't think that it is, because the court has ruled here twice now that the government erred. The government was in the wrong by using the Emergencies Act. And the reality is the individuals who were hurt by this are victims of government overreach. And so I think that Pierre Poilievre would be right to call that what it is. And I also think that it would be a big waste of taxpayer money to appeal this to the Supreme Court. You know, the taxpayer, Carl's right, taxpayer is going to pay one way or the other, but you're either going to pay a bunch of lawyers to waste more time at the Supreme Court, or you can pay the victims of the misuse of the Emergencies Act.
Sabrina, do you think that calculation that Mel just sort of laid out and that we've been sort of circling around here, better to make settlements than not? Do you think that that's the best option?
Yeah, because I think that the government wants to put this to rest as well, right? I don't think the government wants to keep talking about this, 3-week incident in 2022. I think they want to move forward and talk about, again, what I think are future national security concerns. And I think that putting it to rest and putting it to bed prevents it from being in the news cycle for the next, 6 weeks or 6 months, depending on how long it would take to get to the Supreme Court. When it comes to Pierre Poilievre, I actually don't think Pierre Poilievre has left it in the past. He's actually brought up the case specifically about convoyers, both in Alberta and in Ottawa, multiple times over the last 3 years. And so I actually think he's probably going to overextend his hand on this. And in the same way that I think the Liberals tried to talk about the pandemic way too long after it had ended and people stopped caring, I think Pierre Poilievre is likely going to be somebody who talks about this way too long after people have stopped caring. Of course, it plays with his base. People like, people who are pushing the referendum, the separation movement, those kinds of folks, that's going to play to them. But for the rest of Canada, that rest of 70%, I don't think it plays with them. And I think he risks losing credibility with those folks.
Mel, I'll give you the last word in 15 seconds on that.
It's never the wrong move to fight for justice. And in this case, justice belongs to the victims of government overreach.